May 12, 1945. The train shuddered to a halt, a long, mournful screech of iron on steel that seemed to echo the grating of the women's own nerves. Inside, they lurched forward, their faces pale masks of exhaustion beneath a layer of grime. For weeks, they had been fed on rumors as thin as their rations. Whispers in darkened barracks and propaganda bellowed by officers, clinging to the last shreds of a collapsing Reich, painted a grim future. Some braced for a firing squad, others for the crushing darkness of slave labor in the mines. All of them, without exception, feared the violation and starvation that were the promised spoils of the victor. Their uniforms, once a source of pride, were now little more than rags, creases replaced by dirt, boots cracked, hair held back in desperate knots. They were soldiers stripped of their weapons, auxiliaries, with no war left to serve, women unmoored from their homeland. The heavy train doors groaned open, and for the first time since the surrender, air that did not reek of smoke, steel, and collective fear rushed in. A young woman, perhaps 24, her sharp cheekbones carved even deeper by hunger, was the first to descend. She instinctively clutched her worn coat tighter, a futile gesture of self-preservation, as if fabric alone could shield her from the humiliation she knew was coming. But what greeted her was a profound and unsettling silence. The land around her was flat, quiet, and impossibly clean. Wooden fences stretched into the distance with geometric precision, and barbed wire glinted in the sunlight. But there were no snarling dogs, no bellowed commands. American guards in crisp, neat uniforms stood waiting with a calm, almost bureaucratic detachment, their rifles held in a way that suggested they were tools, not immediate threats. The silence itself was a form of pressure, more unnerving than any shouted insult. She braced herself for the inevitable cruelty. And then it came not a blow or a curse, but a smell. It drifted on the breeze, a ghost from a world she thought had vanished forever. It was warm, greasy, unmistakably rich. Bacon. Sizzling. She froze, her boots rooted to the gravel. Behind her, the shuffling of the other women ceased. The sound of their own breathing seemed to stop. Bacon was not food. It was a memory, a word from a sunlit kitchen before rationing, from mornings where fathers still came home and sirens did not tear the night apart. To smell it here, at the very threshold of captivity, was an obscenity. It was like hearing laughter in a graveyard. Her stomach, long accustomed to emptiness, twisted in a violent knot of rebellion. A visceral memory surfaced. Her last meal in Germany, a watery broth of turnips and a heel of stale bread that crumbled to dust in her hands. She had devoured it, racked with the guilt of knowing her younger brother, if he was even still alive in the rubble of Leipzig, might not have that much. And now this. The Americans were cooking pork for their prisoners. A dizzying wave of anger, shame, and a strange, reluctant yearning washed over her. The guards gestured for them to form lines, their voices firm, but not unkind. One even attempted a broken German phrase, "Bitte schnell." The women obeyed, their movements stiff and automatic. Each step forward was an act of surrender, not to the guards, but to the scent that grew stronger, more intoxicating, with every yard. It became a magnet, pulling their hunger and their memories into a single, bewildering force. For some, it was too much. One woman began to weep silently, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Another muttered a curse under her breath, convinced this was a psychological torture, a way to mock them with a luxury they could never have. But for all their fear and fury, not one of them could stop inhaling, drawing the impossible aroma deep into their lungs. The war they had been trained to fight, the enemy they had been taught to hate, had not prepared them for this. This was not a battle of bullets and steel, but of something far more insidious. It was an assault on their certainty, and it began with the scent of breakfast. Inside the camp, the strangeness continued, unfolding with an almost theatrical quality. The barracks were sturdy wooden structures, not the ramshackle huts they had envisioned. Inside, straw mattresses were lined in neat rows, and actual windows, unbroken, let in the morning sun. Buckets of clean water stood ready for washing. It was a far cry from a palace, but compared to the damp basements and burned-out shells of buildings many had last called home, Its deliberate order was profoundly unsettling. "It reminds me of boarding school," one woman whispered, her tone laced with bitterness. Yet the words themselves carried a dangerous seed of comfort. It was a world with rules, but perhaps not the cruel ones they had anticipated. The 24-year-old found her gaze fixed on a larger building ahead, a mess hall from which smoke rose in steady plumes. Through the open doors, she caught glimpses of trays being set with plates. Real, ceramic plates, not the tin cups or slop buckets of a desperate army. Her throat tightened. She had steeled herself to be herded, cursed, and stripped of every last vestige of dignity. Instead, she was met with a quiet efficiency, a discipline that did not seem to require cruelty as its fuel. She did not trust it. None of them did. This had to be a performance, a calculated softening before the real punishment began. When they were finally marched into the hall, the sound hit them first a sharp, energetic crackle and hiss of fat rendering on hot iron pans. The air shimmered with the heat, thick with the scent of salt and smoke. Behind long counters stood soldiers in aprons, yes, soldiers wearing aprons as if they were mothers in a Sunday kitchen calmly turning strips of bacon with metal tongs. The sheer, mundane absurdity of the scene was a blow to the senses. The women shuffled forward, their eyes darting from the food to the guards, unable to reconcile the terror in their hearts with the domesticity before them. A plate was handed to her. On it lay a scoop of potatoes, a thick slice of bread, and to her utter astonishment, 2 strips of glistening bacon. The 24-year-old stared down at it, her hand trembling so violently she feared she would drop it. In that moment, the food ceased to be food. It was an indictment. She thought of her mother, who had died during an air raid 2 winters ago, clutching a faded photograph of her father, who had vanished into the endless snows of the Russian front. She thought of the skeletal children she had seen in the streets of Dresden, their hands like tiny claws reaching for scraps of coal. And now, here in the hands of the enemy, she was being offered this feast. Her chest ached with a confusion so profound it felt like a physical wound. A part of her wanted to refuse, to spit in their faces, to prove that her spirit was not so easily bought. But her body, a traitor to her pride, had already made its decision. She raised a strip of bacon to her lips and took a bite. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, warmth. It exploded in her mouth, a symphony of sensations that summoned ghosts. It tasted of memory and shame and a relief, so fierce it felt indistinguishable from grief. Hot, unbidden tears sprang to her eyes, tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She ate quickly, desperately, as if to outrun the return of reason. Around her, others were succumbing to the same internal war. Some laughed brokenly through their tears. Some chewed slowly, reverently, as if committing a sacrament. A few pushed their plates aside, their pride a shield too heavy to lower, even for this. But for a few minutes, the hall was filled only with the quiet, rhythmic sound of chewing. An American guard leaned against the doorway, observing the scene. He was young, perhaps 30, his uniform impeccably pressed, his face impassive. But as one of the women looked up, her eyes met his. He offered the smallest of shrugs, a gesture that seemed to say, "It is just breakfast." That simple, dismissive motion was more devastating than any weapon. It dismantled the entire mythology. They had been fed a mythology that required their enemies to be inhuman monsters. A shrug suggested a world where captors could offer casual kindness, where food was just food, where the lines between good and evil were not drawn in blood, but were perhaps just a matter of perspective. It cracked something deep inside them. When the meal was over, the women were led back to their quarters. The 24-year-old lay on her bunk, the wooden ceiling swimming above her. The taste of salt and smoke still lingered on her tongue. She felt both heavier and lighter, as though a great weight had been shifted but not entirely removed. She did not know if she could trust the Americans, if this was generosity or a more sophisticated form of strategy. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her war had changed. The enemy was no longer a simple, hate-filled caricature. That night, as she listened to the steady rhythm of boots on soil during the patrol, she realized the bacon had filled her stomach, but had hollowed out her convictions. Breakfast, she now understood, was only the beginning. The morning still began with the familiar clang of the bell and the scrape of boots across the yard, but soon a new sound seeped into the camp's rhythm. It was the murmur of voices bent over books, the scratch of pencils on cheap paper, and the halting, unfamiliar cadence of English words being forced from German tongues. The Americans, it turned out, were not content with merely feeding their prisoners' bodies. They intended to feed their minds. The initial rumor was met with bitter laughter. Lessons behind barbed wire. It was an absurdity, another psychological trick designed to erode their pride. But then the guards unlocked a long, unused hut, cleared the space, and arranged simple wooden benches in neat rows. A scuffed but serviceable chalkboard appeared, followed by boxes of books, some with pages yellowed and softened by time, others smelling sharply of fresh ink. The campaign that had begun with bacon was now advancing with sentences. The 24-year-old entered the makeshift classroom with deep reluctance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if to physically shield her beliefs. The other women shuffled in with the same wary suspicion, their eyes fixed on the blackboard. An American sergeant stood before it, and in clean white chalk, he had written a single word: freedom. He underlined it twice, a stark, definitive stroke, then turned and smiled as if the word itself were a form of nourishment. The women exchanged uneasy glances, the word hanging in the air between them, a promise, a mockery, a challenge. The lesson started simply. "Good morning. How are you? My name is..." The sergeant, a man with chalk dust on his fingers and an easy grin, exaggerated his pronunciation, his voice almost playful as he coaxed them to repeat the phrases. Some muttered the words through clenched teeth, a final act of defiance. Others giggled nervously at their own clumsy attempts. The 24-year-old kept her expression stern, a mask of indifference, but when she whispered the foreign words, she felt their strange lightness on her tongue, so different from the guttural weight of her own language. Soon, the Americans introduced films. One afternoon, the women were herded into the mess hall, where a projector rattled to life. The flickering screen illuminated a reality they had been conditioned to deny. They saw images of their own ruined cities, but then the footage shifted to something else entirely. Piles of corpses in striped uniforms, emaciated figures with haunted eyes stumbling through liberated camp gates. The women stared in stunned silence, their faces bleached white by the projector's glow. Some whispered denials, calling it trick photography, enemy propaganda. Others turned their heads away, unable to bear witness. The 24-year-old felt her stomach knot into a cold, hard fist. She had wanted to believe such stories were exaggerations, lies spun by the enemy. But the camera did not flinch. The truth unspooled before them, grainy and undeniable. The bacon had been their first shock. This was the second, infinitely darker. The Americans offered no commentary. They did not shout accusations or demand confessions. They simply let the images burn themselves into the women's minds. Then, they led them back to the classroom, back to the books, as if to say, "The world you believed in is a graveyard. Now, you must learn the language of the one that remains." After the films, some women resisted more fiercely, retreating into a stony, impenetrable silence. But others leaned forward, their hunger suddenly transformed. It was no longer just for food, but for knowledge, for understanding, as if education itself were a ladder that could lead them out of the rubble of their old lives. The 24-year-old found herself drawn to the boxes of books. She picked up a battered copy of Huckleberry Finn. The English was a struggle, but the rhythm of the sentences and the wild, untamed freedom of the boy's journey on a raft was strange and intoxicating. She began to read in secret at night, hiding the book beneath her thin blanket as if it were contraband, not a gift. Humor, when it came, was sharp and unexpected. During an English drill, the sergeant tried to teach them the word bacon. Before he had even finished writing the letters on the board, a wave of laughter erupted through the room. It was a raw, cathartic sound. The women exchanged knowing glances, their shoulders shaking. For a brief moment, the barbed wire outside seemed to dissolve. The sheer absurdity of it all, the enemy, teaching them to name the very food that had first unsettled their Souls was too much to contain. The sergeant just grinned and let the laughter run its course. Yet for the 24-year-old, guilt was a constant shadow. Each new word she learned, each page she turned, felt like a betrayal. She thought of her brother, buried somewhere under the ruins of Leipzig, who would never read an American book. She thought of her mother, who had died believing in a victory that had become a classroom behind wire. Was she betraying their memory by allowing herself to be moved by these stories, these lessons? The alternative, however, was to retreat into the darkness of ignorance, which now felt like a different kind of death. The war had shifted once more. It was no longer a battle of guns or even of propaganda. It was a battle for her very imagination. The gates opened with the same metallic groan that had once seemed to swallow them whole. But this time, the sound was one of release, expelling them into a world they no longer recognized. Months, for some even years, had passed behind that wire, and the women who stepped out were not the same ones who had first inhaled the scent of bacon with bewildered suspicion. The 24-year-old clutched a small bundle. She carried a few items of clothing, a notebook filled with her halting English, and a worn copy of a book a guard had left behind. She had survived captivity, but she felt a cold dread realizing that survival outside the fence was a far more uncertain proposition. The train that carried them back toward the heart of Germany rattled over landscapes scarred into silence. Entire villages lay flattened, with lone chimneys rising from the ash like the broken teeth of a skull. Twisted steel skeletons of bridges hung over stagnant rivers, catching the afternoon sun. The women pressed their faces to the grimy windows, a silent chorus searching for any landmark of the world they remembered, only to find wreckage. One woman whispered that the Americans had treated them better than their own bombed-out cities ever would. Another muttered that perhaps captivity had been a form of mercy in disguise. No one had the strength to argue. Their minds were heavy, haunted by the images of meals eaten in relative peace, while their own families, just beyond the wire, had queued for hours for turnips and bread made black with sawdust. When the train finally ground to a halt, the 24-year-old disembarked into a maelstrom of chaos. Crowds surged on the platform, a sea of gaunt faces and hollow eyes. Children with sunken cheeks clung to their mother's skirts, their voices small and thin with hunger. She stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs, overwhelmed by the sheer, desperate cacophony of need. For one shameful moment, she longed for the regimented lines of the camp, for the cold certainty of the morning bell, for the predictability of a meal she did not have to fight for. Freedom was supposed to taste sweet, but this tasted of ash and absence. Her hometown was gone. Where neat rows of apartments once stood, now only rubble sprawled, the bricks and mortar scattered like bones. She found the street, or what was left of it, and stood before the cratered space where her family's home had been. A neighbor, a woman made old before her time, recognized her and delivered the news with the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had seen too much death to afford grief. Her brother had never returned from the final defense of the city. Her father was a name on a list of the dead at Stalingrad. Her mother was crushed beneath the beams of the house during the last air raid. The words landed like blows, yet they hollowed her out, leaving a space too vast for tears. She stood amidst the ruins, clutching her bundle, the ghost scent of bacon rising cruelly in her memory. To have been fed while her entire bloodline was extinguished, was that survival? Or was it the ultimate betrayal? The days that followed were a strange, suspended limbo. She found shelter with distant relatives, who eyed her with a mixture of pity and sharp suspicion. They had endured the hunger, the cold, the terror of the bombs. She had been a prisoner, yes, but her cheeks still held a touch of color. Her frame was not as skeletal as theirs. One evening, her aunt asked the question that hung unspoken in the air. What did you have to give the Americans in return for their food? The question was a blade. How could she explain? How could she describe a survival that had been offered through order, meals, and books, without any demand for barter or humiliation? Her silence was taken as confession, deepening their mistrust. She was an alien among her own people. On the streets, children with bellies swollen from malnutrition stared at her, their eyes holding a resentful accusation she could not answer. At night, the lessons from the camp returned to her. She remembered the chalkboard word, freedom, and the reckless joy of a boy on a raft in the pages of Huckleberry Finn. These memories were a world away from the ruin around her. The Germany she had returned to was not only destroyed in stone, but in spirit. The bacon became her secret shame. Every time she smelled the thin cabbage soup her relatives cooked, her mind would betray her with the memory of it sizzling in an American pan. The contrast was a form of torture, a secret she locked away, a burden that isolated her completely. One afternoon, she saw a crowd gathered around an American military truck. Aid workers were handing out tins of food. She stood at the edge of the crowd until a soldier pressed a can into her hand. The label was in English. Her throat tightened until it ached. The war was over, and the enemy was still feeding them. The pattern was undeniable, a truth too heavy to bear. The enemy had fed her in captivity. Now they fed her people in their ruin. Something inside her, something she had held onto for dear life, finally began to break. As weeks bled into months, the 24-year-old began to write again in the small notebook she had carried from the camp. At first, it was just clumsy English sentences, scraps of memory, questions that echoed in the silence of the night. She wrote about her brother, trying to conjure his face before it faded completely. She wrote about her mother, her hands dusted with flour in a kitchen that no longer existed, but more and more, she found herself writing about the camp, the impossible smell of bacon on that first morning, the quiet impassivity of the guards, the fine white chalk dust on the sergeant's fingers as he underlined the word freedom. Her relatives, catching her hunched over the notebook one evening, frowned at the foreign script. Why waste ink on their language? Her uncle grumbled, his voice thick with the bitterness of a man who had lost everything. She lowered her eyes, unable to explain that it was not their language. It was now a part of hers. It was the language that connected her to a world that had not been entirely reduced to rubble, a world where an enemy could offer a plate of food instead of a bullet. It was the language of a possibility. She clung to like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. Slowly, painfully, she came to understand that her captivity had not ended when the gates swung open. It lived on inside her in the violent, unending conflict between memory and reality, between the propaganda she was raised on and the undeniable truth of her own experience. She was physically free but mentally bound, torn between a profound loyalty to the dead and the unsettling kindness she had been shown. The bacon, the books, the films, they had not merely filled her stomach and her time. They had fundamentally changed the architecture of her mind. She could not unlearn what she had learned. She could not return to the simple, comforting ignorance of hatred, no matter how much she sometimes wished she could. One evening, she walked back to the flattened ruin of her street. The sun was setting, bleeding red and orange across the sky, casting long, distorted shadows over the broken bricks. She sat on a large piece of stone that might have once been her doorstep and opened her notebook. With a hand that had grown steady, she wrote a single, clear sentence in English, "I am still alive." The words looked fragile on the page, almost absurd against the backdrop of total devastation. Yet they felt stronger and more true than any uniform she had ever worn, any slogan she had ever been forced to chant. She closed the book, pressing it to her chest as the silence of the ruined city settled around her. The memory of bacon lingered, no longer just a taste, but a complex symbol, both a gift and a curse. It had been the first proof of a world beyond the barbed wire, a world where enemies fed you instead of starving you, where words were offered instead of whips, where books were given instead of commands. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. It was something far more dangerous, possibility. Staring at the ruins of her city, at the ghosts of her past, she finally realized that surviving the war was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a different, more complicated battle. This one would not be fought with weapons and armies, but with memory, guilt, and the fragile, audacious hope that a life, that humanity itself, could still be rebuilt from the ashes. She rose, tucking the notebook securely under her arm. Her steps were slow but deliberate as she began to walk back to her relative's cramped apartment. The streets around her echoed with hunger and resentment. the raw wounds of a nation defeated. Yet inside her, the sizzling echo of bacon refused to die. It whispered of contradictions, of unsettling truths, of a future that had not yet been written. And as night fell over the ruins, she understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. The war had ended, but the real battle, the one for meaning, was only just beginning.